With its symptom-based medicine approach, conventional medicine tackles depression completely wrong. Rather than determine what actually creates that depression, many doctors immediately reach for their prescription pad. That explains why 1 in 6 Americans take some kind of psychiatric drug, mostly antidepressants. This is not normal. Let's say you complain to your doctor about chronic feelings of sadness and despair. He or she might say you have a disease called depression, but depression is not the cause of your sadness and despair. It's just a name we give to a group of people for the purpose of giving them all the same drug therapy. Feel sad and full of despair? You have depression and you need an antidepressant. Case closed, but it isn't.
Literally for 60 years, I struggled with feeling depressed. It's not fun to be that person who can't get up and go because it's just not, the enthusiasm just isn't there, you know. Nobody ever associated my depression with diet, with food before. They just didn't make that connection. When I started eating right, you know, the clouds lifted and I thought, wow. And I was diagnosed with celiac. It's like, wow, okay, this wasn't my fault and it's getting better.
When I was struggling with Hashimoto's, it was really, really scary for me because I had anxiety attacks and panic attacks that I'd never had before. I started to have new onset anxiety disorders and I started to have social anxiety. One of the worst things that happened with Hashimoto's is that I started to have brain fog. The brain fog that comes along with thyroid disease is quite scary because you don't know what's happening to you. So you can go from being this really intelligent person that's on top of your game, you know, can tell jokes very quickly and can study things and remember things very quickly, to all of a sudden walking into rooms and forgetting why you got there in the first place. That can be very, very scary when you feel like your mind is slipping away from you, where you're slowly losing parts of yourself. People with thyroid disorders can exhibit a lot of symptoms that affect their brain. Some of the things that I've seen are going to be fatigue, brain fog, apathy, irritability, anxiety, panic attacks. We're also going to see times of depression. I've seen people who are misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I've even seen people who were hospitalized for psychotic disorders as a result of Hashimoto's. But actually, the thyroid condition can be a root cause of a lot of your brain symptoms.
When we see a lot of chronic patients have hypothyroidism, their chief complaints are depression and fatigue, and most of that is brain-based in some of these patients. Because as their brain gets inflamed, they can't activate their brain, so they have depression. Their fatigue is really brain-based, because they have no need to do anything, and everything they do activates their brain. So their exhaustion and depression is really all brain, has nothing to do with the thyroid. So when they spend all this time trying to figure out the right thyroid medication dosage, they're usually unsuccessful because they haven't really addressed their brain autoimmunity or their autoimmunity in general.
What I really like to recommend for people with Hashimoto's and for thyroid disease is to focus on eating a whole foods-based diet that's minimally processed.
We published a study 4 years ago. We looked at 400 healthy blood donors in the US, and we measure their antibodies to wheat protein and milk protein. And we found that there's actually close to 15% of the population that had antibodies to different proteins associated with casein and gluten, right? And of those, we found half of them had brain antibodies. So the Hashimoto's hypothyroid person is very genetically susceptible to gluten and wheat. So when you add in their antibodies for the thyroid attached to the brain, and being thyroid hormone deficient turns on brain inflammation, and many of them have gluten intolerances, and that turns on brain degeneration, brain inflammation, we see that.
As far as nutrients go, some of the most important nutrients that we want to address are going to be selenium. Selenium deficiency has been recognized as an environmental trigger for thyroid disease. We find that 200 to 400 micrograms of selenium methionine can reduce the attack on the thyroid gland by about half. We also see that it reduces anxiety. We also see that it reduces hair loss and a whole host of other thyroid symptoms. Some things that you can do in your very own home include going on a gluten-free, dairy-free, and soy-free diet. We see transformations sometimes in as little as 3 days, where people's symptoms will melt away once they do that.
Vitamin D is a critical brain nutrient and has been linked to improvement in cognitive function, and delay in many chronic brain disorders. Do you have food allergies or sensitivities? Food allergies create a metabolic disorder that can lead to a whole host of mental symptoms, including depression. Gluten and dairy are the major culprits. In fact, partially digested dairy and wheat particles are found in the urine of severely depressed patients, as well as children with autism and ADHD and schizophrenics. These proteins change the brain function and can lead to not only depression, but also psychosis and autism. What are the symptoms of gluten sensitivity, and what kind of brain disorders actually are resulting from gluten sensitivity?
Oh my goodness, it runs the gamut. There are a number of papers of reversing schizophrenia. In the medical literature, reversing schizophrenia with a wheat-free diet, these are not celiacs, these are gluten-sensitive people. Reversing schizophrenia, a year later, they're still checked out of the treatment centers and they're not on any meds. And they publish a year later, these people are fine now as long as they're wheat-free. Yeah. So it can be schizophrenia. Most common is depression or anxiety. Those are they're called the affective disorders with wheat sensitivity.
Well, one of the things we've been learning over the last few decades, in addition to the brain science of how we can increase our brain connections and build new brain cells, is that inflammation is a common denominator across a whole spectrum of diseases, pretty much all chronic disease, whether it's heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, of course, autoimmune and inflammatory diseases, but also brain disorders. We know that dementia is inflammation of the brain. We know that autism is inflammation of the brain. We know that depression is inflammation of the brain. In fact, they're recommending anti-inflammatory drugs to treat depression. That's the wrong idea, but it shows you where the science is going. So what causes inflammation? Well, guess what? It's the usual culprits. It's our diet. We have a very inflammatory diet, high in sugar and processed foods, low in the good fats that are anti-inflammatory like omega-3 fats. It's low in phytochemicals, which are plant compounds that are anti-inflammatory in our food, like vegetables and fruits and spices like turmeric. And all of these really promote inflammation in the body. Sugar is probably the worst. And then, of course, there's other insults. We have things like Lyme disease and tick infections, viruses, and we have gut dysfunction. Gut dysfunction is probably the other major driver of inflammation, because when your gut's inflamed, like most of our guts are, it creates inflammation not just in your gut, but throughout your body and in your brain. Toxins also play a role in driving inflammation. Stress plays a role in driving inflammation. Lack of exercise is inflammatory, and exercise is anti-inflammatory. So all these insults and all these factors are driving inflammation in the brain that leads to autism and Alzheimer's and depression and mood disorders and more. Are bugs in your gut affecting your brain or your immune system? Work with a functional medicine practitioner to determine and eliminate gut issues, including a leaky gut, irritable bowel syndrome, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and other gut issues.
In the last 10 or 20 years, the gut-brain axis has been a really hot topic in the research literature, and even now in the popular media. I think a lot of people have heard that there's a connection between the microbes that inhabit our gut and our brain, that things like intestinal permeability or leaky gut, when the gut barrier breaks down, that can cause problems with our brain, and it may be connected to conditions like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. And then, as you mentioned, the most current theory on what causes depression is known as the inflammatory cytokine model of depression. So that's a fancy way of saying that when our gut becomes inflamed, it produces chemicals that travel through the bloodstream, cross our blood-brain barrier, and suppress the activity in the frontal cortex. And that produces all of the telltale signs and symptoms of depression. So
should we be taking Advil for depression?
Absolutely not, because that's actually going to make the gut worse over the long term. We know that Advil can cause ulcers and a whole bunch of other problems in the gut. But what we should be doing is attending to our diet. Diet is a crucial factor for gut health. If we eat a lot of heavily processed and refined foods, that causes a pro-inflammatory microbiota, which means it feeds pathogenic bacteria and bad bugs. Allows them to proliferate, and then they produce compounds that can be toxic to the brain.
Do you have hormonal imbalances? Out of balance hormones like insulin and cortisol can detrimentally impact depression. A real, whole, unprocessed foods diet combined with lifestyle factors like stress control can help balance your hormones.
things like parabens, BPA, they mimic estrogen in the body and disrupt our own natural hormonal rhythm. High stress is huge and contributes to hormonal imbalances, so there's a lot of variables.
Another major cause of depression and anxiety is stress. Constantly feeling stressed out is a surefire way to become depressed or stoke the fires of depression. Did you know that your phone and computer addiction can also contribute to depression and anxiety? More and more studies have been coming out showing the link between too much internet usage and screen time and mental and mood disorders like ADHD, anxiety, depression, and more. When you fix your body, you fix your broken brain. Your energy, your memory, your focus, and your joy will all increase. Depression will fade away like a bad dream. Here are some important steps for managing depression and anxiety today. First, eat whole, real food. Feed your brain and body with a nutrient-dense, whole, fresh, plant-based diet that includes plenty of protein and healthy fats. Increasingly, research shows that sugar consumption can contribute to depression. Become a detective and find and avoid hidden sources of sugar, which are more prevalent than you think.
We're addicted to sugar for a number of reasons. One, it's in everything. A second reason that I think is overlooked is we've shifted our palate. Very salty, very sugary, very kind of powerfully flavored foods. And so people's palates have shifted towards craving and desiring that. So there's a way that as we talk about sugar being toxic, part of me feels like people have gotten quite confused. Sugar is a nutrient that our brain is quite dependent on and uses every day, and maintaining healthy blood sugar is absolutely critical, and cutting out simple sugars from your diet is one of the most important steps, I think, for people to take to reclaim their eating. At the same time, when you eat a plant-based diet, you're eating a lot of sugars, but they're a slower burning, lower glycemic index sugar, and they come again with all these nutrients. What's really, I think, hurting us are the sugars, the empty calories that don't come with any nutrients.
Exercise regularly and intensely. Again, studies show exercise is as good as, and even better than antidepressants in treating depression. And in fact, one of the most powerful things it does is increase BDNF. That's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's like Miracle-Gro for your brain. And what that does is it increases new brain cells, it increases the connection between brain cells. So you can remake your brain at any age. And exercise is one of the most powerful tools to do that.
Exercise for our brains lights it up. And as we talked about exercise sounding like movement, really lighting up the brain. We can be in a state of stuck. And we can go from that state of stuck to feeling lit up just by movement, just by exercising. A simple 10-minute walk can start to fire those neurons and start to wake everything up and really turn the lights on.
Also, get enough sleep. Terrible sleep will only contribute to and exacerbate depression. So you want to aim for 8 hours of solid, uninterrupted sleep every night.
It doesn't take a neurologist to tell you that lack of sleep makes you crazy. Sleep is incredibly important for the remapping of neurons, of consolidation, trimming of thoughts and emotions and processes that happened all day. It's like you eat a meal, you got to digest it. You have an experience, your mind has to digest it.
Feeling fully energized and maintaining great brain health ultimately requires taking out the bad stuff and putting in the good stuff, including food choices and lifestyle choices. Many of us get too little good food, too few nutrients, not enough good light and air, water, rest, sleep, rhythm, exercise, both mental and physical, and too little community and love and meaning and purpose. Getting all of these ingredients for health is absolutely important for an optimally functioning brain. Using the advice outlined by our experts can create major shifts in your body and your brain. In the next episode, we talk to our experts about traumatic brain injury, which unfortunately is rarely treated properly. You'll learn how things like diet and supplementation can actually help create dramatic recoveries after traumatic brain injury. I'll see you there.